Welcome to the Imposters. This is a podcast about expertise. Who gets to define it? Who gets recognized as an expert? And whose knowledge is overlooked in humanitarian and development spaces? The Imposters recenters aid around affected communities and lived expertise. In each episode, I speak with refugees, migrants, and Global South practitioners whose expertise is shaped by experience, context, and leadership. These conversations explore what expertise and legitimacy look like in the sector, and how imposter syndrome is often a systemic outcome rather than a personal failure. Each guest joins the Imposters, an archive of lived experience experts in global development. We are a growing network of practitioners committed to elevating lived expertise in humanitarian and development work. I am your host, Laila Raouf. Welcome to the Imposters. So today I'm joined by Nana Ama Boa Amponsem. Nana Ama is a Ghanaian education policy and system specialist with over a decade of experience strengthening education systems across Ghana and the wider sub-Saharan Africa region. She currently serves as Assistant Director of Programs at the Education Collaborative at Aseshi University and is also the co-founder of Think Education, where she works directly with schools to strengthen leadership, management, and learning outcomes. Her work bridges policy and practice, combining lived experience, systems thinking, and decolonial approaches to education reform. So, in this episode, we explore what it takes to shift power in education systems, whose voices are still missing, and how locally grounded expertise can reshape how education works for every learner.
Thank you, Lila. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. I'm really excited for this conversation in particular. So, I like to start every conversation with the same question, which is considering your long background in education development, do you ever feel like an imposter in this work, particularly in the global education and policy space?
So my response to that question would be yes and no at the same time. And I'll start with the no. The no in terms of my knowledge, my experiences, and how much I understand the work that I do. I don't feel like an imposter in the sense of that's deep knowledge and understanding of what I do. Yes, in the sense of, when I come out of those spaces, right, the actual on the ground spaces, and I move to more global international spaces. In those conversations, a lot of the time, then I feel like, um, do I know as much as I supposedly do? Am I left out of certain conversations, or are my opinions, for lack of a better word, less intellectual, less, theoretical, less grounded in some kind of perspective? So yeah, those in those moments, yes, I have felt like an imposter. When I'm on the ground, the work that I do engages or connects with, then I don't feel like I'm an imposter. I don't feel like I'm not wanted, or I don't know enough, or I'm not in the right place, or in the right seeing the right things. Yeah.
So it sounds like you're saying maybe in your everyday practice, you feel very confident and like an expert in your work. But when you enter, maybe when you shift into the global education policy space, that's where maybe it changes.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say that, just picking up on that, I would say that it's kind of less of a feeling than maybe something that the systems have produced. Well, I say the anchor of this conversation is on decolonial practices. Just bringing it up that it's something that the system has produced in, global South having less of knowledge and less of, yeah, really less of knowledge, right? And maybe global North
Mhm.
having knowing. right? And whose knowledges are centered, whose knowledges are acknowledged. So I would say it's less an individual feeling and more something that systems and practices have normalized and produced.
Yeah, it's almost like this maybe unintentional, maybe intentional, but a systemic consequence of coloniality is this imposter syndrome of practitioners in the global south. At least that's my theory. Even though I'm not from the global south, my family has experience with migration, and that has been my experience in the being positioned in the global north, that we have an attitude and assumption about migrants and refugees, that they need training, that they need support and help only from the global north. And
Uh-huh.
that's really what I've dedicated a lot of my research to, is trying to, like, counter that narrative that I think is really harmful, and honestly, and I don't think it's very correct based on my lived experience. So I do want to talk more about your professional journey because I think it's so interesting. You've spent over a decade working across Ghana's education ecosystem. So, how did your early experiences shape the path you've taken into education systems and policy work?
Um, I kind of stumbled in education after school. I feel like I've said this story over and over again. Typically, as I was in education, teaching was like my go-to, right? And so I started to teach, and then because at the time I had the most, will I say, education in the school that I was teaching at, I kind of rose to assistant principal in that school. That was a low cost private school, actually. And so, in this low cost private school, at a more leadership level, my eyes kind of opened. I became more aware of what as a teacher, you're in the classroom, and sometimes, depending on what your role is, you may or may not have a lens to what leadership, what the day to day of leadership is. But now
Mhm.
in this role, I was exposed to that on a day to day. And coming from in a more privileged, growing up in a more privileged context, I I feel like my lens, I had like a magnifying lens, right? Like a
Mm.
magnifying view of it. I was interrogating those systems, comparing. So it just kind of started as, what can I do in this school that I'm in? And gradually that became, okay, what can I do in this system, in this sector of schools, working with school leaders, trying to improve what school leadership is, especially for local private schools. And of course, as that started, my research exposed me to, bigger challenges, greater challenges, more systemic challenges. And that had sort of driven what I've done over the years since that. And so I would say that that journey very much came from living in, being exposed to that on a day to day, moving from individual school to more systems level, and systems level to more like wider level education.
Yeah, that's such a great response. It also shows how we think about lived experience, or at least, in this podcast, I'm thinking kind of about geographic, cultural, like identity lived experience. But also sometimes professionally, that lived experience of having been a teacher and know what it's like to operate as a teacher before moving into maybe an administrative role.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So do you think it helped that you started off in teaching before moving into more systems level policy work?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wouldn't have it any other way, because starting as a teacher puts you at the bottom level when you're even like drafting policies, that all of that higher level systems work, right? You can still be detached from the everyday realities. And there's a lot of times where policies are not practical, are not contextual, right? And that's because policymakers sometimes are really disconnected. You're in your office and it may be like in a city and you're really disconnected. Even if you're the policies you're drafting are across, as the board for all levels of learners, you can be so removed and so detached from on the ground realities of learners. And so I would definitely say that starting off in the classroom, and especially in a classroom that was not I would say I won't call it rural, but it was a low cost private school, and that city is not in the top three of cities in Ghana. So I would say that starting off at that level also was really really helpful, very instrumental in shaping what my lens is of education across Ghana, right? And what education looks like for a rural learner, and not typical learner in a city where because in Ghana especially it's kind of decentralized, but at the policy level, it's very much centralized. And so I would definitely say that starting off at that level really gave me a much better view, much better perspective than I would probably have had if, I immediately started from, policy or research, in education.
I'm interested to hear more about your research. And I know that you're also, interested in, decolonial approaches to education reform. So, from your perspective, what does a decolonial approach to education systems look like in practice? Maybe not just in theory.
Yeah, I think the name is kind of self-explanatory, but really what a decolonial approach is really allowing the local voices to lead in their knowledge, lead in perspective, lead in what's and kind of unpacking what works, right? And there's a lot of conversation around adopting and scaling, which is great because we do need to scale best practices. But in scaling best practices, we still need to let local voices lead in adapting and not adopting. Local voices need to lead. Local voices need to tell us what works, right? I mean, obviously, it's much easier to bring a box and say this is what is working, this is what we provide in the box, use the box, right? But that doesn't always work, and we're seeing it in now. There's a lot of interrogation around aid, and especially the aftermath of USAID pulling out, and also just education aid gradually decreasing. There's just a lot of unpacking of what aid has truly done, regardless of how much has been put in projects, programs, in communities. And it all comes down to whose voices and whose understanding is really shaping what we say works and what is practiced. And that's what I think a decolonial approach is. And it shouldn't just be on paper, because and just an example that I kind of want to, bring in this discussion because it's very much, it's very applicable. In my dissertation, the UCL dissertation that I submitted, while in my research, one of the things that came up very strongly, so my dissertation kind of looked at, the aftermath of the USAID and it pulling out. One of the things that came up quite strongly was this thing of whose voices are leading, and whose voices we are censoring, because a lot of the time the failure is because the local voices were not listening to the real education agencies that work in the communities. We're not listening to the teachers. We're not listening to the school leaders. We're not listening to the learners. We are saying that we're listening, but we're really really not listening. And when we design education programs and draft policies that we say should work, or should be applied in these contexts. And that's really what a decolonial approach is.
Hmm. What you just shared made me think about a conversation you and I had. So we met at University College London's Institute of Education. I was based in London and you were based in Ghana. And in one of our forums, after the USAID cuts, there was a lot of discussion about that. And I remember you posted that critique, which you just explained. And I remember it turned into a conversation between us. And I was asking you, what does your LinkedIn look like right now? Because mine, as an American who used to work for the US government, was just former USAID contractor, public servant after another, talking about the loss of USAID fundings and how devastating this is going to be. And there's no solution moving forward and whatnot, and a lot of, grieving the loss of that funding. And I remember I asked you, what does yours look like? And you told me that it was like quite opposite of, like, maybe a little bit
Mhm.
more positive of there is opportunity that comes out of this and really maybe kind of referring to dependency theory. Do you remember that
Yeah, I
conversation?
do. I do very much. I do. I do. Yes, and and also a decolonial approach is actually taking out dependency, right? Because dependency is kind of colonial, right? It's hard conversation, it's a hard reality, but developing countries or developing communities need to come out of the dependency mindsets. And that's what happens that will happen when we're leading. We're leading in what works. And that may not always be tied to funding. A lot of the time when we talk about, what's working and what should be done, then there's funding. But what does that financing look like? And it's a lot of the time tied to grants and what external countries and donor countries would give. But that's still not us leading. Us leading is how internally can we make this happen, assuming that all of that is not available anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the center, it needs to be whose voices are being centered in these complex global education policies that are being developed. Can you speak a bit more, maybe explain your work with Think Education and the low cost private schools? So, what have you learned from Think Education about leadership and management and how that shapes learning outcomes in particular?
I would say that I would say school leadership is very important in getting to what we want to see in learning outcomes, because how the school leader how a leader leads, right, in their schools inform their policies in their schools, informs how teachers are engaged, how teachers develop professionally, what happens in the classrooms. It informs what kind of learning approaches are used, how the school engages with the wider community. It really kind of influences everything. And I think school leaders are an untapped resource, really. And there needs to be more emphasis on how school leaders lead and manage their schools if we want to see certain outcomes in education. And especially in the context of low-cost private schools. At least in my context, school leaders have a voice, but in the state-funded schools, for instance, they kind of have there's kind of a rubric. It's easier because someone's, for lack of a better word, doing the work. And what you need to do is pick it and use it in your school that you're leading at. And a lot of the time, school leaders do have access to resources, professional development. I mean, obviously, there's conversation around this, right? But they do have a certain access that local private school leaders don't have. And local private schools are still serving a large population, of learners, and especially out of the cities. Like when you move into more out of the city, communities, towns, etc. These schools are very pivotal to how education is happening, what's happening in education. And I do think that there needs to be a lot more emphasis how school leaders are supported, especially in this brackets of schools, because it's kind of up to them, right? There's the curriculum, but it's their show and they need to be supported more to get us to what we want learning outcomes to look like. There's a lot of, well, I say, critique of low-cost private schools, critique of, the quality, obviously, the financial, well, I say, regulation of it, access, if they're excluding a
Right.
certain, you know, a certain population. But the truth is, they exist because they're meeting a critical need. And I think actually coming back to the conversation on decolonial, and that's an example. Local private schools are really an example of when communities lead, right? Because it's coming from a place of seeing that there are gaps in state-funded schools. There are communities where state-funded schools are overpopulated, they are out of reach, and individuals will lead, right? And when they're leading, they are solving a gap, they are solving a need, they are solving a challenge. And what needs to be done in support of that is not exclude them from policy when we're thinking about what should be working for developing countries or global south countries, right? We should really include them. I just think a lot more emphasis needs to be put in school leadership, especially for low cost private context.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I agree. And for those who are, familiar with low cost private schools, they tend to proliferate in fragile contexts or low income contexts where state education just cannot provide adequate access to its population. So it's very common for private schools to pop up. Um, same as you, I also have conducted research on, private schools, but refugee-led private schools, but it's a big research gap,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not a lot of emphasis or evidence around
Mm-hmm.
what are the learning outcomes in these low-cost private schools or these refugee-led schools they also operate as low-cost private schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested to know your opinion, but to me, I see it as a form of marginalization because they don't fit these universal global education frameworks of the world. When I say world, it's really a few powerful actors have decided is quality education.
Mm-hmm.
And I completely agree with you. And I apply the same decolonial, theories to my research of these low cost private schools, these refugee led schools are actually decolonial education in practice. And there's a lot to learn from them. It's just, it hasn't been a research priority because they don't fit these
Mm-hmm.
universal standards.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm interested. I have an opinion. I already have an answer to this question, but I am interested based on this conversation. So considering you're talking about how these school leaders are this really untapped resource,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they should be integrated into decision making about education development. How do you feel about the current global policy shift to emphasize localization that's currently happening?
That's yeah. I if you ask my honest opinion, think the localization discourse is still more paper than practice, if you ask me. It's coming from, so there's, like I say, the there's funders who are calling for localization. Then there's the middlemen, right? How do I explain it more practically? The
Like the
so
government level education leaders, or do you mean like the
I
international
no
NGO?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. International NGOs, yeah, international NGOs, and those closer to the funders. Then there's the actual communities, and I think that localization has become a go-to word because obviously the evidence showed that, and funders called for it. So international NGOs are catching on to it. If you'd ask me, I don't think that localization is really happening yet. It may take some time for us to actually see that communities are leading. There's still a lot more that needs to be done. And I think it's still a catchword now and not really happening, if you'd ask me.
Yeah, um, I agree. I mean, I think it has a lot to do it's just a strategic shift from the USAID cuts. I think it's a little bit reactive, at this point, maybe a bit performative. I I
Yeah, yeah.
wonder from, like, a social justice perspective if the intention is coming from the idea that these communities have the capabilities and the agency to lead, or is it just coming from the funding cuts? And if it's just coming from funding cuts, it makes me worried that if funding resumes, then it'll go back to like, status quo.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I guess we'll see. You mentioned you were talking about financing earlier, and I do want to take the topic to talk about results-based or innovative financing. Can you explain like what excites you about these models, and then where do you think they need to be handled with care?
I think innovative financing is I think it's a good development as we begin to think around increasing opportunity for learners who have been excluded and just improving the quality of education, especially for developing contexts. Where I see that we may be lagging towards a bit more, and again, into letting global voices lead is, and this is an argument that I've made in a paper I put together recently, is a lot of the time when we talk about innovative financing, we're still talking about it's still whose voice, right? Who's calling it innovative and who's deciding what innovation is, because it's pulling financing and pulling money from stakeholders who won't typically fund education, right? And it's making the most from these to improve learning outcomes. But then again, for developing context, right, it's is it that innovative? Because it still grants money at the end of everything. It's still money that's coming from external agencies, external stakeholders, funding that is still determining what we should be doing, right? And so then again, the danger lies in who is shaping this voice, who is shaping what should be, and in innovative financing, allowing local voices to kind of say what is innovative, what should be innovative, what should be outside of the box, right? In how we are pulling together financing and pulling together funding to address, learning gaps and learning challenges. That I would say is one thing that we need to be looking at more closely, because more and more as, innovative financing approaches are developed and built, how often do we see that local voices are shaping these approaches, right? It shouldn't be a box that we put together and say that this is what we have for you, and this is how we think that you should be financing, education systems to improve the learning outcomes. It should be, what do you have, and how can we use what you have to, improve learning outcomes? Is what I would say.
Yeah, that would be a more localized approach to innovative financing, ideally. I love how you frame that of, what is the definition of innovative that you're working with? And I had the same reaction when I started learning and working with innovative financing approaches, because when I first started learning about results-based financing, I had the same reaction where I was like, this doesn't sound that innovative to me. Like, to me, to me, innovation is like diaspora coming together and pooling resources to be able
Right.
to
Yeah.
school in a fragile context, or low cost private schools or refugee led schools are the most innovative accomplishments, grassroots accomplishments I've come across. So I had the exact same reaction to you, and I think it's because innovative financing is coming from the neoliberal um, development model, and you know, uh, you and I are experimenting more with decolonial approaches, but maybe there's potential for us to meet in the middle
I do
and work
think so.
together.
Yeah, yeah. I do think that at the outside of the financing and the funding models can be made more contextualized, more local, can bring in more local inputs, because there's so much evidence that shows, like what you said, right? Diaspora and what's the revenues that they bring in, and how do we really tap that's I'm just trying to pull that I recently saw how much. I think it's so much money, so much more money than
Yeah,
um
remittances that
yeah,
people
yeah,
send back
yeah,
home. Yeah.
exactly. And how do we pull that funding and shape it in a way that, advances communities? Because external and donor funding is 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 still very much, um how do I put I don't want to say colonial. It's not really colonial, but it's still very much like someone giving you money to do something. And with that, of course, there'll be conditions. I mean, if
Right.
anybody gave me money, it won't be just because you love me so much, right? There will be conditions attached to it. And of course, I mean, the conditions are not bad conditions, but we really need to start thinking more innovatively. And I think that lens of who defines innovation um, should bring in more local voices
Mm,
in the
I
mix.
love that. Well, I see your future PhD topic already. Would be perfect for exploring that. Before we close out, I just have one more question. So, as someone who's embedded in national and regional systems, how do you navigate power while also staying accountable to communities? It's a hard
I
one.
yeah, it is a hard one. It is a hard one because it's a fine line and it's very tricky because sometimes the two don't always intersect, right? I mean, I do think that more and more foundations and international NGOs are beginning to accept what communities need. Sometimes that isn't always donor priority. And I think that evidence is one of the ways to get that to happen, right? Because you cannot when there's consistent evidence that shows something, it's very hard to, disprove that, right? And so I think that it's really trying as much as possible to show what's working, document what's working, and then, saying that this is what is working and this is what's um is looking like in communities, and this is what community interests should really be prioritizing. I don't know if I've answered the question, but I think it's really more evidence and showing what works. Sometimes evidence is in a small school, but how do we catalyze that and show that this is one way to go when we're really trying to center what works for local communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, when talking about evidence, which we can also refer to as just like producing research on these
Yes, yeah,
topics,
yeah.
like to
Yeah.
me, that's just the importance of having lived experience in research because lived experience is a lens or an angle to these issues that is really irreplaceable. And being able to integrate that into your research and or the evidence building or research projects around these topics can really produce innovative contextual results for education. At least that's my hope.
Yeah. And I think just to add to what you shared, it's also amplifying local research, right? Because
Yes.
again, it's, amplifying the voice, local voices. And there's so much local research on some of what we see is working in different communities where education is concerned, and not just education, but across different social services. And I think as we need to more and more be amplifying and creating avenues where local research and local voices are amplified.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I am curious to know, is there anything on the horizon for you professionally that you're excited about?
Yes, actually. Yes, yes. I think, and I would say shout out to you for that because I think one of the things that our conversations did is provoke certain thinking for me, like beyond, beyond the studying, right? What
Mhm.
decolonialization look like. And when you said you were starting a podcast around this, I was like, wow, this is so great. And I would really look forward to something that I also kind of did. And so
Yeah,
what's on the horizon is I'm taking my decolonial, conversations to another platform where I am trying to amplify local voices, especially in education research. And so these conversations are really looking at the research by local researchers on local communities in Africa and some of the hidden things that didn't show up in their research. And just trying to center them and amplify these voices and what they do.
I love that so much. That sounds so exciting and what a like an interesting topic. And I agree there needs to be different medium where we talk about these topics rather than, publishing a research paper is useful, but it's only reaching a certain audience
It's
and
certain
storytelling and
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
sharing this information, supporting the evidence building around this, especially as we're shifting towards these conversations about localization. It's potentially a really big moment for like power holders to consider other approaches. So I'm so excited for your project and I can't wait to like follow up with you on it.
Thank you, Lila.
Well, how can people follow your work or get in touch if they want to?
LinkedIn. I'm not very active across social media, but I'm quite responsive on LinkedIn. Could search my name, Nana Ama Boa Amponsem, and shoot me a message there. Definitely connect. Very happy to.
Well, thank you so much. As we wrap up, today's conversation with Nana Ama reminds us that real education reform starts with trust in communities, in local leadership, and in the expertise that already exists within education systems. Her work challenges us to rethink whose voices shape policy how power is navigated, and what it truly means to take a decolonial approach to systems change, not in theory, but in practice.
Thank you so much, Lila. It was such a lovely conversation. Really looking forward to it.
And that's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's conversation, visit theimposters.org, where you can explore episode resources and browse the wider archive of lived experience experts. Tune in to The Imposters wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Lila Raouf. Thanks so much for listening.